Hey everybody, welcome back to our weekly podcast. My name is Patrick Tan. I'm the General Counsel for ChainArgos, and with me, as usual, every week, Jonathan Reiter, our CEO and Chief Data Scientist. Thanks for joining in. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for the likes and subscribes. We appreciate that. Thank you also for the feedback on some of the topics that you want us to cover from week to week. So this week, what we have, not really audience inspired, but some of it is audience inspired ish.
Thank you for the topics which we ignored.
No, we didn't ignore them. We can only take things in the sequence that they were received. So anyway, this week what we're going to talk about is the Kraken, then some of that ongoing litigation with the SEC. John, for a change, is going to opine on the law, as opposed to me.
Okay, all right.
And then we'll talk about Spiko. He'll tell us what that is about. And for a change in flavor, I'll be running through the data this week instead of the law. So I'll be running through some of the U.S. Tether kind of blacklisting, and take a look at some of the blacklisting, some of the activity in some of these wallets that get blacklisted just ahead of them getting blacklisted. So that's stuff that you may not have necessarily seen in the Wall Street Journal coverage of the data that was produced, but we'll be going through some of the details, and no real surprises, but still interesting to look at. Right, so John, tell me a little bit more about this Kraken v SEC stuff.
So this is Kraken's response to their ongoing SEC issues regarding being an unregistered securities exchange. I would recommend people read the response. It's very readable in that they've filed a response paragraph by paragraph where their paragraphs are numbered the same as the SEC paragraphs they're responding to. So it gets very, very repetitive with, denies the allegations and whatever, but you end up with, it's 70 paragraphs or something. Many of them are single sentence paragraphs saying denies all the contents of. So you can just skip them when you're reading it. You find the paragraphs that have a long section, and then you can immediately find the thing they're responding to, bring them up side by side. It's very readable. I mean, it's legal and a bit technical, so maybe not the most exciting in the world, but it's much easier to navigate. Sometimes these filings pull quotes from various places and respond, but you don't know what they're responding to because you're not immersed in this day-to-day. So what we really want to focus on here is the ways in which there's some pretty absurd arguments being made. The core of Kraken's argument is that they don't trade investment contracts, they just trade digital assets, tokens, whatever, so the logic that they're trying to apply is none of these things is a registered security. All we do is trade digital assets. Digital assets effectively can't be securities because all we're doing is trading things that aren't investment contracts, and there's no other basis on which they allege that these things are securities, and so we're good. All right. And that kind of breaks down in some very interesting ways. The first thing to note is they claim, I'm going to quote from the thing here, the digital assets themselves cannot be the investment contracts because they carry none of the rights and obligations of a share, of a stock, a bond, or any other financial asset. The digital assets themselves are the only things that are traded, brokered, or settled on Kraken. Take the second part first. The ownership records are the only things traded on any exchange. Right? So it is not meaningful to say all we do is trade the ownership records because that's all that's ever traded. Right?
Could I just pause there for a second and ask a silly question?
Please.
My understanding of how exchanges operate, and I could be wrong, is that they don't actually physically, because all of the assets, all the crypto assets go into like a wallet. Well, it could be a cold wallet, it could be a hot wallet. It's just kind of munged together in a place. And isn't it the case that the exchange actually just, like let's say if I have 100 BTC, I trade it with you, you trade it for me, and then only when we settle and we want to take it off ramp, then there's actually a physical transfer within the exchange itself. Isn't that the case?
Conceptually, that's how people think about it. The exchange could give each of us a separate blockchain address or other sort of account and affect transfers among them as long as they were all under the exchange's control. But whether that's a single wallet or multiple is a semantic.
But to be fair, they don't do that because that would incur gas fees and the rest of it. So
that's true.
They just keep
us. They could run their own chain without fees.
No, fair enough. But we know that most of them don't do that. We know that they just reconcile it at the end of the.
Yes.
So isn't it kind of misleading to say that the digital assets themselves are the only things that are traded? Not
Well, they're
exactly.
traded in the ownership record. So what the exchange
No, but I
does is
think
it tracks
I
ownership
understand.
record transfers.
Correct. But what they seem to be suggesting is that the only things that are traded are the assets themselves, which is misleading because it's not a DEX.
Oh, well, okay. If you want to be as sort of ridiculously pedantic as they are, and I think they're also wrong here, as your purposefully argument is, yeah, they're not actually trading the assets. They're
Yeah.
trading ownership records for the assets in their own database. This
Correct.
is related to exactly the point I was trying to make, which is all any exchange does is trade the ownership records of the underlying assets, things, because that's what happens. The whole point, the whole reason we have stock exchanges, for example, is that executing complex investment contract paperwork every time you, or ownership transfer paperwork, whatever, every time you trade a share is the inefficiency that, the Dutch figured out how to fix 450 years ago. Yeah, so that's just absurd. That's all that every exchange does. The only question is whether or not the things they're trading are securities, and the way in which they're alleged to be securities is through being investment contracts. The tokens themselves are not separate from that concept. It's all the same thing. Otherwise, the New York Stock Exchange could say, all we have is database records.
We're not trading
And
securities.
we're just trading database records. We're just tracking ownership of things. Those things are somebody else's problem.
But that
now, in
seems-
that case, they're registered securities. But as we'll come to in the end, I think if Kraken's arguments are correct, we can tell you exactly how to set up what morally is a stock exchange, a securities exchange, but which is completely exempt from all securities regulation through a relatively trivial sleight of hand that cannot be what is intended.
And I could be wrong, but that seems to be the disingenuous argument that they're trying to make here, because it seems that I've seen this so many times. It's exhausting, guys. Knock it off. But I've seen this so many times in the crypto space, where again, it's an issue of nomenclature as opposed to a substantive issue of law.
Well, not even nomenclature. They made up some vocabulary.
Which is what it is. You know what I mean? Like
Made it up. It's not.
they made it up. So to claim that they own, first of all, the digital assets themselves are the only things that are traded. That's not true.
Well, okay. So it seems to be a four-part argument they're making. The first is that all they do is trade ownership records of assets. Fair enough. Then they say that none of the assets at issue are investment contracts. So the government's claim that they're securities is false because the government claims they're securities on the basis of there being investment contracts. Ergo, nothing Kraken's doing is subject to SEC jurisdiction. So the last two of that follow from the first two, right? The issue is the claim that these things couldn't possibly be investment contracts, and that all that Kraken does is record ownership records. So if we look at the tokens in question, so there's 11 of them, I think, that are on the list here. Essentially, all of them have a native staking and governance mechanism. They don't all. So Filecoin is on there, has native staking, but governance is off-chain, and Mana is a little bit, there's no native staking, there's some other kind of collective burn thing going on, and Solana doesn't have any native governance. But the other tokens all have native staking and native governance. So the idea that all Kraken does is keep track of ownership records of assets, and that the assets have nothing to do with being any kind of investment contract. The assets don't do anything else. They're dumb assets. They're playing cards, right? They're trading cards. They're collectibles. These things are exactly the assets that you use to participate in the return earning staking procedures of the network, and the governance, i.e. voting, like voting a share type thing. That's at least close enough to equities that pay dividends and allow you to vote on corporate actions, that the claim that these things are just dumb digital assets that couldn't possibly be related to anything else, that just seems crazy to me. It may be the case that the judge decides, or whoever decides, that these things are not in fact investment contracts, securities, whatever it is, but the claim that all they do is track ownership records and there's nothing else going on, when the things they're tracking the ownership records of absolutely do other stuff as relates an ongoing enterprise, and that's exactly what a stock exchange does. It tracks the ownership of things that entitle you to receive dividends from the company and vote on corporate actions of the company. Generically, it's some more complexity there. So it seems like they're pretty much admitting it and just saying, but because they're digital, it's all very different. Like everyone is executing complicated transfer paperwork and wet signing it in the basement of a stock exchange. This feels like the same crypto people who are confused and think that banks just have piles of cash in the basement. Right? This is not how any of this works, which is a bit strange.
Yeah, everybody knows that that's not the case. It's Scrooge McDuck style, like a whole bunch of coins, gold coins in a big vat.
Now, the way in which this becomes a little bit complicated is they are all now an alternative set of arguments they make is that none of these things are registered as securities. None of them appear to qualify as securities.
I love this one.
So because they're not registered as securities, it's not their responsibility because no one's alleging that the issuers did anything wrong, right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, they haven't gone after issuers generically here. They've just gone after other exchanges. Now, the Securities Act, the Securities Exchange Act, so this is the 1933 and 1934 Acts, are incredibly clear about how this works. So there are tests, whatever, rules, there are properties of things that make them securities. There is a procedure for registering securities. And there is liability for doing things with securities that were not registered properly. That's 1933. The 1934 Act comes in and says, if you run a securities exchange, an exchange that deals in securities, right? So registered, unregistered, whatever, and you don't have a license, that's a problem, right? So Kraken's argument amounts to saying if there's unregistered securities being traded, the issuer is the only one at fault. And the regulations would make no sense if the only one at fault was the issuer, because what you would do is you would set up a shell company, issue the tokens, not register them, shut down, bankrupt, whatever, the shell company, and then everybody else could trade them forever and nobody would ever be liable. And that just doesn't seem like what you'd want to do here. Similarly, because they're asserting that a whole list of tokens which all have a native yield generating mechanism and a native governance mechanism that the tokens govern, right? You probably see where this is going. You can set a company up, right? You can set up a mechanism on some tokens that is the thing that administers the corporate functions of that company. And then you can just shut down one of the related entities and list them on an exchange somewhere, and no one ever has to register for anything. Because, if, let's scroll back up here and get some of these token things. So if Filecoin, Cardano, ICP, Mana, Matic, if these things are all obviously not securities because the governance and dividend staking earning rights just have nothing to do with the way a company works, you could definitely organize a company that works this way and then not have to register for anything. Mana in particular doesn't have a staking mechanism in the traditional sense. It has a collective sort of buy and burn. You can imagine organizing a company where the earnings get put into buybacks of stock and retiring of them, right? Then you've got almost exactly an on-chain voting mechanism, a buy and burn, or a staking that pays out the earnings of the underlying activities. There you go. Job done. No longer any need for any securities regulation. You've just exempted yourself completely if these arguments are right. Which I am not surprised this is where some of these arguments have ended, because when you begin with sort of logical fallacies, you're going to end up with really incorrect conclusions. I suspect the government's response will point this out. Similarly, the judge is not going to accept the idea that you can't get in trouble for trading unregistered securities as an exchange because you're not the one that failed to register them. I mean, that's just not what the Securities Exchange Act says. So,
yeah, that's a good question. So, like, if I own the crack house, am I responsible with the dealer sale?
Well, a lot of financial crimes have far stricter liability than those sorts of things, precisely because plausible deniability can't work in an environment where you're automating everything.
Fair enough.
It can't be allowed to work or the whole thing falls apart.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit. And what the hell is Spiko?
Okay, so this is great. So this connects to things we talked about before. This is very interesting. So Spiko, S-P-I-K-O. So this is a French. They're running some on-chain-ish money market funds, and they're interesting for a couple of reasons, right?
I believe it's pronounced on-chain.
Well, yeah, there is some extremely French stuff going on here. So the first thing to say is there is some French distributed ledger technology regulation rule, whatever stuff going on. And they use it, but they use it in the most French possible way. So they have a very long description of what a DLT is and how it allows you to use some way of whatever, tracking assets on a blockchain, something like that. Right? They then make clear that just in case there are any problems with the way their DLT is implemented, they have to have a mechanism for asset recovery and correction. Because everything has to be whitelist, allow list, whatever. We've talked about this before. The French rules, the EU rules in general require all of that. And then they fall back sort of the lowest level at the end of the 500 paragraph, whatever, document describing this, the whole thing, saying that they, in addition to all of their DLT stuff, they also have to I will read the exact phrase here, ensure that every movement affecting the registration of the digital assets is evidenced by a transaction regularly registered in the client's account. So this whole scheme and way of arranging it is an extremely French way of saying, well, you still have to keep traditional records anyway, and they're controlling. So fair enough. And we're not surprised by that. What I find interesting, anybody that has experience doing finance with French stuff and non-French stuff knows the French stuff is always a little bit more complicated and harder to figure out. But here it's exactly the same pattern of Frenchness happening like that. So a second interesting bit in the documentation, it's not particularly French, it's just particularly standard. They have a whole list of countries they exclude. The usual suspects are excluded, North Korea, whatever. They also exclude North America, and then I will read, North America, United States. If you are an accredited investor from the United States interested in investing in Spiko funds, please reach out at, they give an email address. This is what we talked about with the qualified custodian and offshore fund stuff. I think that was last week. They're saying we're not registered, we're not set up in the United States at all, but there are exemptions we're aware of and offshore procedures and ways of doing this. So generically, U.S. retail, no. U.S. accredited investors, contact us. There's a way to do this. Don't worry about it. Right? So this is a case where they are complying, and they are surely going to be following all of the rules, because this is a traditional, in France, it's an SICAV is the vehicle people use for these things. But it's nice to see that at least some traditional providers are doing these kinds of things correctly. And then if we just look at some data on the utilization here, go. So they have a euro-denominated and a dollar-denominated fund. What we're looking at here is the Ethereum data. If I remember correctly, on Ethereum, the dollar fund is the vast majority of the volume, and on Polygon, the euro fund is the vast majority of the volume. Anybody has any suggestions for what that is, we're all ears. It's an interesting feature. I have no clue why that is. But you can see here the euro fund, you're looking at millions of euros a month, which is not huge. The dollar fund is bigger, right? So, it's tens of millions in August, a little bit September. But it's still, these are not massive funds. And if you look at the sort of largest sender and receiver addresses, you can see that there are very few people involved in this stuff, right? Not a lot of addresses transacting here. So it's still very small, but they have put together a, as far as I can tell, essentially globally compliant vehicle, because it can handle U.S. investors of the appropriate type completely legally in an offshore vehicle, and then a whole bunch of other countries, and they have exclusions, and they have their backup key recovery procedures and security and everything, which is just interesting to see. Again, I would not exactly say these volumes are a massive success, just because it's relatively small.
Well, I guess it takes time, right? I mean,
that's all fair. And look, if it turns out that people who follow these rules aren't getting meaningful investors, and you have to flout the U.S. rules to get investors, that is
that's a data point.
Yeah, it suggests that maybe some rules need to be changed, reorganized, whatever things need to happen. Somebody needs to figure out what's going on. But that's the kind of glaring data point that you don't just obviously say, we'll pass an exemption and move on. You'd want to find out why before you decided to do that.
Well, if you're going to pass a blanket exception, I think that's called the purge.
I just meant in particular for this type of investment.
Fair enough.
Anyway, all right,
so on to more data. Ooh, double bill data day. So you've seen this data. Now I'll take you through some of the blacklisting stuff. And one of the things that you didn't see in the Wall Street Journal, and you can get the report if you ask us, you can get this information. And this is basically, so some customers have asked, why did we select 90 days before Tether blacklists an address?
Well, sorry, go back and explain what the x-axis is first.
Yeah, so I'm gonna get to that. So this is a chart of what the transaction activity looks like just before Tether blacklist an address. So this is like 90 days. It's from left on your screen. It'll be from left to right. 90 days is on the extreme left, and obviously all the way on the extreme right is when the 0 hour and the address gets the kibosh. Now, the stuff in blue is basically the sum of transfer amounts, and the stuff in orange is the number of unique transactions, and that's what that is. So one of the things that, and we were quite clear, and this is on the Ethereum blockchain, and if you look at Tron, it's more or less the same. You sort of see the same activity. So just look at the Ethereum one, because that's visually it's much more obvious. What happens is that you see like a low hum, like a low roar of activity of transactions coming out of these addresses. So although it says sum of transfer amounts, this isn't in and out. This is just purely out. And you see sort of like a rush for the exits just in the week to 1 to 2 weeks just before the address gets blacklisted. But
No,
that's
so sorry. So we see steady outflows
Yeah.
from wallets in the few weeks before they get blacklisted. They don't know they're going to get blacklisted.
they don't know they're going to get
And then we see what is visually very clearly a dramatic escalation beginning
Just in the
2
last
weeks out, and then in the last week really much higher, larger numbers of transfers
Yep.
out of to be frozen wallets and
Correct.
increased amounts coming out. And this is across hundreds or thousands of wallets across a long period. This is not 4 observations.
So so we use the 90-day period because this gives you a good sense of like, is there is there a significant uptick in activity towards the end, as opposed to, like, let's say for instance if we went too far back, like say 180 days, 360 days, that you never know. But within the 90-day period, it's sort of like, and the reason for that, of course, is that it's not that, at least I'm not of the view that it's like Tether getting on the phone and calling these people up and say, hey, you guys better, beat it, because otherwise your stuff's gonna get frozen. But more that, like, if you are in the general vicinity of doing illicit activities or performing illicit activities and stuff like that, and as the heat starts to grow on you, you kind of have a good sense that we're likely to get sanctioned or something like that, then you would make your way to the exits. So
Oh, sorry. I would also say we've definitely seen circumstances in which a wallet is only active for a short period of time before it is blacklisted.
Yeah.
Right. So there are plenty of wallets for which there could be no outflows 90 days in advance because there hadn't ever been any inflows.
Correct.
So part of this is simply going to be that wallets are, they need to be active before they can be blacklisted.
Correct.
And sometimes there's a theft, it's a hack type stuff.
And to be fair, we've also seen wallet addresses for which we don't fully understand why they were blacklisted because they had no activity at all. But oftentimes, much of this stuff happens off-chain, and so it could be stuff like, the guy's apartment gets seized, he gets his public address and stuff like that, and law enforcement tells Tether to freeze those wallets.
I still think there's also a fair number of transcription errors, but
Yeah, any number of things could happen. But the point of this is that, not so much to say that, oh, Tether's doing a bad job, everybody's getting out the gates before they get closed, but more that just to highlight how difficult this is. This is challenging stuff.
Yeah.
When you have a situation where everything is permitted, and you can only kind of like work it out after the fact, the reality, of course, is that you're not going to be able to sort of freeze a whole bunch. You're not going to be able to stop a whole bunch getting out the door. So is that the system that you want? I don't know. I mean,
A common complaint that comes from the other perspective, you consider here maybe one of these guys that was active for 90 days, guys or gals, didn't do anything wrong until they got a bad customer 3 days before the end, and they got shut off.
Yeah.
So actually, there's nothing dodgy going on with the fact that volume is dramatically elevated at the end because we got a great client. Oh no, that great client got us blacklisted. Right? That could happen as
Correct.
well, and that person needs to have an incentive to pay attention and not have that problem. Right? There needs to be a disincentive for them to make that mistake. But it's impossible to expect them to do a perfect job and just have perfect prescience. That's not the way the world works.
And so the question, of course, that we get from time to time is, but the bank. Oh, I've heard this false equivalency all the time. But the banking system is just as bad as the bank. No. The defense that the banking system has is that it's slower.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the slowness associated with not transfers necessarily, but account opening procedures, right, is to bandwidth limit the whole thing so that you can't just create a whole bunch of additional addresses and run around people and DDoS them effectively. That's by design. Some of that slowness was done explicitly for this reason, and this is a benefit of that slowness. It is certainly a security benefit of that slowness from the perspective of the people who are trying to enforce OFAC sanctions, things like that. It's clearly not a benefit to people who would just like to open a bank account. People complain about this all the time, right?
Yeah.
So that cuts both ways. That is a trade-off that there is no obvious solution to. It's certainly not going to be. Any improvement in one direction is going to have a cost in the other, right? And so you're trying to find a compromise. It's not like you can just solve both of those simultaneously. You cannot. this is solid evidence that you can't just trap all of them. And it's not like people think if Tether was more responsive, it would make a difference. It wouldn't.
The system itself has challenges, and also if you think about it in a banking system, let's say for instance a bad actor has sent funds from one bank account to the other bank account. You can continue to trace those funds across to the next bank and stuff like that. And there's stuff that you can do. There's recourse. Again, because this is permissionless.
Well, I mean, that's a combination of permissionlessness and a lot of the sort of OTC dealers here operating completely outside of the legal system.
Yeah.
So they're not regulated, licensed, whatever. If you're dealing with wire transfers and money transmitter type folks that are all within the system, it's much easier to at least get records out of them. And because they've opted into, in the U.S., but they've been fingerprinted as part of their registration, whatever, they're more likely to get into real trouble, so they have more incentive to do it correctly. Yeah, so.
Finally, one of the questions that came up was who blacklists. Well, it's not to say who blacklists most, blacklists best, but who just blacklists in general. So this is like over the last 5 years, we just really looked at Circle and Tether. This does not contain remove blacklist. Basically means so Tether is one of those who actually takes people off the blacklist.
Okay, these are only.
This is only
blacklisted
blacklisted
events.
and
Okay.
continues to be blacklisted at the time that we're recording this thing. So let's just take a look. So you can see the vertical axis is the number of addresses which have been blacklisted, and this is just
This is
dates.
by day?
Yeah, this is just by day. And then let's just switch off Circle. Let's just switch off Tether for a while, and you'll see that the scale changes significantly. And there ain't a whole bunch of blacklisting done by Circle. On the biggest day is like 62, and this was like in November of
Well, that's
2022.
right after the FTX event. Yeah,
That's
FTX
correct.
event.
That's after the FTX event. By way of comparison,
No, is it?
yeah,
The
yeah.
11th is the 11th.
Yeah,
is-
that's
yeah.
around the time. And let's look at what happens when you switch on Tether. I mean, like, it's orders of magnitude more in terms of blacklisting. Now, to be fair, Tether has a lot more transactions. Tether also is on more chains. There's higher velocity of transactions and stuff like that.
And they seem to be more popular in what we're now supposed to call frontier markets.
Yeah,
So
frontier
they
markets.
may have more customers with trouble. Right?
Correct. So I'm not saying that, and we're definitely not saying that. Tether is a hit in terms of the blacklisting game and stuff like that. But we also have to remember that Circle's stated policy is that if you don't have a court order, we're not gonna freeze the address, which is a high bar to cross. You know what I mean? Like it's like it's not even the bar of a search warrant. A search warrant is easy to get in general if you have probable cause. But here you're requesting a specific court order, and courts are generally quite reluctant to freeze an asset unless there are very good reasons.
Well, I would also say, with respect to, there have been circumstances in which there's clear blacklisting by Circle has been much later than blacklisting by Tether and other stablecoin providers. Also, if you have to go to a court, try to find the gentle way to say this. There are certainly people using parts of this system that are under surveillance by groups whose evidence does not get given to the court because it doesn't meet those standards. Right? So if you imagine you're dealing with espionage, terrorism, smuggler, whatever type stuff, you could certainly have a situation in which signals intelligence or whatever identifies somebody blowing something up or smuggling it, whatever it is, and that evidence isn't, well, at least people have seen movies, right? That evidence doesn't go in court. That's not the way that part of the military intelligence government operation works, but they could still say to law enforcement, you should definitely stop this. Right? Things like that are a plot point in movies routinely and are definitely real. I mean, when we see, we talk about the Middle Eastern stuff, you see those blacklists getting produced, it feels unlikely that the standards of Western court systems for evidence could be met, certainly in open court, by the people who are compiling those blacklists, right? And that's an extremely high bar to expect. We're not passing judgment on what the right way to do this is, just that you're going to get very different outcomes that way.
Yeah, it's not to say that.
I mean, if covert surveillance is the way you got the address,
Yeah.
Circle's just not interested in listening to that information because they need it to go through a court. We're not saying they're wrong, right? That's a trade-off.
There are it's tough, but TLDR it's a tough thing to manage, and we're not saying that one way or the other is better or worse, but it is something. It is a data point, and it is something to take note of, because are we really, preventing the harm that we want to in this system? I don't know. I think it seems that, like, if you look at the statistics, what was it? We spoke about it last week, where on Tron at least, funds that were on wallets that were ultimately blacklisted by Tether,
Well, huge
like
numbers.
huge numbers, like 99%.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, I wouldn't even really question if what the goals are. I would say at some point you have to accept that your way of doing things is just not working, and incremental improvements are not going to get it to a place where you think it's working. If you're capturing 0.2% of the money that goes through the bad person wallets, and the bar for you to get stuff shut is that high, right? You're getting this much money escaping the wallets before they get shut down. You're getting this few wallets frozen overall, and you have such a difficult procedure to get stuff frozen in the first place, and your catch rate is very low, and you've been working at it for a while. Maybe it's not that you need to work harder and do a better job. Maybe it's that this is just not correct. I mean, I've made fun of a number of crypto projects where, like, the team is working all night to effectively build the faster than light spacecraft. Like, you're not working harder is not the solution here. You're doing it wrong. And it maybe this evidence is stark enough that people will at least listen a bit more to that perspective.
I don't know, but one can hope.
I mean, look, if it's possible that people can get that 0.2 up to 40% and they can get rid of that big blip at the end where all the money escapes, fair enough. But you've had a while and you haven't gotten there, so
I think the only way you'd be able to do that is with a bunch of precogs.
a system that relies on the ability to see the future is unlikely to work well in practice.
Well, I mean, Tom Cruise saw that, so
You know that's not real.
yeah, of course. I mean, if it's not real if you don't think so. Anyway, on that note, thank you for tuning in wherever you get your podcasts. This week we have a little bit more visuals, so if you're tuning into the podcast audio only, you may want to drop by the YouTube channel just to take a look at the bit of the data, because we didn't really describe it like an NFL announcer describes the game. So otherwise, have a great weekend. Drop us your likes, comments, and subscribes. We really appreciate when you guys do that. We do promise that eventually we'll take a look at some of those comments, and then eventually we'll respond to them.
I respond to comments occasionally now that I installed the YouTube Studio thing. I will write down the suggestions people have for topics. We can.
All right. And indeed, have a great weekend. We'll see you again next week. Take care. Bye-bye.